and that's where we'll focus our effort.
Yes, thank you.
Great, thank you, Senator.
Focusing on the Leadbeater's Possum recovery plan, can I confirm that that still isn't complete?
That's correct, Senator.
I understand there was an emergency intervention 2 years ago in 2015, and that there was a one-year timeline that was established for that recovery plan. Is that the case?
There was, at the time of the Threatened Species Summit, which was held at Melbourne Zoo, and at the same time the launch of the Threatened Species Strategy, and the strategy did list the Leadbeater's possum as one of the species for emergency action. That's correct.
Yes, and there was that emergency intervention with Leadbeater's possum, and basically saying there would be a recovery plan prepared within a year.
On an accelerated time frame.
Yes, within a year, I think was what the commitment given at that stage.
I think that was in an action plan that was published online, Senator, that the then minister released. That's correct.
The recovery plan, having asked questions about it before, I think it's been a draft since a year ago, early in 2016, over a year. Is that the case?
Around about a year. That's correct, Senator.
And is it sitting on the Environment Minister's desk?
It is not, Senator. It is sitting on it's not sitting on my desk, but I'll take that one. Yes.
So what's the delay in finalising it?
Senator, it's a couple of things. Firstly, we got an unprecedented number of public comments, and I know that's some time ago now. We got more than we were expecting, and the group that is the team, I shouldn't say team, the person that's working on that plan to essentially collate all of those comments, document how they've been taken account of in revising the plan to take account of the comments. That needs to be documented. It's problematic because there's 3,700 submissions, which doesn't sound like a lot, but is a lot from a perspective of a recovery plan and a public comment process. Most of those were, a small number of those, 150 odd, were quite detailed comments going to the science, going to the content of the plan, etc. And they were taken account of by the drafting group over that plan, which is comprised of both members of my branch, but also Victorian Government, DELP, Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning officers, and an independent scientist, Professor John Winowski. So that group needed to look at all of those comments. They needed to look at them in detail, agree how the plan was going to be varied to take account of those comments, and then we needed to document that, because under the legislation we're required to give all of those comments to the Minister, including a document explaining how they've been taken account of or not and the reasons why. Whilst only a relatively small proportion of those 3,700 were individual submissions.
How many were individual submissions?
Sorry?
Of that 3,700, how many were individual submissions that you need to do that level of
I was going to go to that. So the balance, I think it's around, I'll find that in a moment. The balance of the 3,700 were what I would term campaign style submissions, but they were individualised. So it meant you couldn't treat them as
the same ask presumably was being made in each one, though.
No. They're all individually annotated with a different, so they are all needing to be covered. Can I put it that way? We think to meet the requirements of the legislation. So we're working through it, and we're close. More recently, I'd also say that there's been a couple of other what I'd call complicating factors. One is that the same officers that are doing that job are also responding to a public nomination for a change in the listing status of the possum that came through in the process that, I'm not sure if you're here for it, but Mr Oxley described earlier around the annual call for public nominations for species to be listed or changed in their listing status. That's a process that's very time-bound in the legislation. We don't have...
So what's that request for a change of the listing spaces? Because I think, is that, yes, what is the change that's being asked for?
So it was nominated for downlisting from critically endangered to endangered, and that process now needs to be considered along with all the other public nominations, and will be going to the Threatened Species Scientific Committee in their next meeting, which is in early June, first week of June, I'm pretty sure. And then there's a time frame beyond which, on which set out in the legislation where they need to advise the Minister on the proposed priority assessment list of species that they think warrant reassessment based on the nominations they've received. And then the Minister has a period after that to determine what ends up on the final priority assessment list. So the officers that are responsible for the plan are also working on that process as well. And so we don't have any leeway on time on that. And the timing of the statutory time of the recovery plan is April 2018. We're confident we'll get in before that, but the other process needs to be dealt with in the immediate.
Okay, so you're confident that you'll get in by April 2018. Do you expect to come in earlier than that?
I'd be very hopeful of coming in earlier than that, Senator. And I note that that's the time frame for the plan to be finalised. So for the Minister to make a decision on the final plan. But
and is there any interaction between the recovery plan and how it informs or is informed by the Victorian Government's Forest Task Force processes?
So that's another potential complication. I'm not saying it is a complication at this point, but as you'd be aware, Senator, the Victorian Government is reviewing their forest prescriptions, or at least their buffers. There's been a lot in the media about this, but also on their website about the review that they're undertaking of the, I guess, efficacy of the arrangements that were brought in 2014 out of the Leadbeater's Possum Advisory Group process that the Victorian Government ran. So that was when they introduced their 200-metre buffers around newly discovered colonies. So they are conducting a review of those, at least the buffers, and I'm not sure if it's more broad than that, and they're expected, well, I understand that they're on their website it says that review will be reported to the government by the end of April, and that presumably the Victorian Government will act on that and make some announcement at some point. So the review
by the end of April, and we're now in mid-May. Do you know whether that has occurred?
I don't know. I don't believe it has occurred. I haven't seen anything, Senator, so we're keeping an eye out for it, of course.
Inquiry and we haven't yet received. On the question, if I may, Senator, just in terms of the number of detailed submissions, there was somewhere north of 50, so 50 plus substantive detailed submissions.
Okay.
May I also add, Senator, that in 2015, a comprehensive conservation advice was prepared for the species, and it was approved back then as well. That's already being taken into account through individual assessments where the species is potentially impacted.
Senator Rice, how are you going for time?
I was just about to respond to that.
I'm not saying you have to finish. I'm just asking for a bit of...
Yes, no, well, I am almost finished on this, and then I can move on to 1.5. But I'm sorry, but that...
It's conservation advice?
The conservation advice, was as part of the emergency intervention that was put in place in 2015.
Sorry, go ahead.
Senator, as I mentioned earlier, at the time of listing, and in this case uplisting of the species, a new conservation advice was prepared. So this was done at the time in 2015, as Mr Knudsen said, at the time of the uplisting to critically endangered of the possum. So when the Minister made that decision, the then Minister made that decision in April 2015, a new conservation advice was published.
And the threatening processes that have been identified in the work that you have done on the recovery plan so far? Can you...
It's been included in the uplisting as well, in the conservation advice that was just referred to.
What are those threatening processes?
Habitat loss and loss of habitat based on historical impacts. Fire, of course, adds to that. They're the ones that spring to mind.
Are you concerned that, I mean, given the government has got through its planning process a commitment for animals not to become, further threatened, further endangered, that while this time is being taken to develop this recovery plan, that meanwhile that the logging of Leadbeater's possum habitat is still occurring?
Sorry, what was the question,
Well, the
Senator?
logging and fire as a result from that logging is still occurring. So as a result of logging operations occurring, every logging operation you hear of, then the post-regeneration burn that ends up burning another old hollow-bearing tree that is has been habitat for Leadbeater's possums. So it's a big worry given the level of time that this recovery plan has taken to be developed. Meanwhile, the threatening processes are still ongoing.
Senator, I think that was why I was highlighting the fact that there was that conservation advice. So if there are logging projects outside of an approved regional forest agreement, then it would be subject to consideration of that conservation advice. So no, we're quite comfortable that we've got advice out to decision makers to inform any actions outside of the RFA areas.
But these are inside the RFA areas where the logging actions are occurring.
So if it's logging within the RFA areas, that's subject to that piece of legislation, not the EPBC Act.
But it will, once a recovery plan is developed, that will impact upon the what is able to be done under the regional forest agreement, won't it?
What I would suggest is, this is why I was flagging that the RFA team was here for the last part to deal with regional forestry agreements, but what we can come back to on a question on notice is the specifics of what needs to be taken into account under the regional forestry agreement in the Central Highlands, and what its connection with the recovery plan is. But effectively, that's been approved for a 20-year period, and any changing in the listing, et cetera, we can deal with explicitly in that question on notice and what the implications are.
All right, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.